An army that had never lost a major battle marched onto a frozen lake. By sunset, its survivors were running for their lives. Historians still debate exactly what happened to that ice, but everyone agrees on one thing. They walked straight into a trap. Not a trap of weapons, a trap of ground, timing, and pride. Built by a 20-year-old prince with almost nothing left to lose. His name was Alexander Nevsky. His enemy, the Livonian Order. Armored crusaders who had never met a force they couldn't crush. Submit, surrender, or face destruction. That was the pressure Novgorod faced. Nevsky had no army capable of resisting it head-on, so he didn't refuse it head-on. He chose the one battlefield where their greatest strength would work against them. Not because the ice would break beneath them, that part is still argued, but because the terrain would trap them long before it did. This is the story of an army so certain of victory, it never stopped to ask why the ground felt wrong. A trap built from psychology and terrain, with the lake itself playing a part no one could fully predict. This is the battle on the ice, and it decided the fate of an entire region in one brutal afternoon. Northern Europe, 1242. The Livonian Order, a branch of the Teutonic Knights, was tearing through the region unchecked. They had already taken Pskov. Novgorod, the wealthiest trading city in the north, was next on their list. Novgorod's people were terrified. The city had exiled its young prince once. Now, desperate, they begged him to return. Alexander Nevsky was barely in his 20s, but he studied his enemy the way a hunter studies a predator's habits. The Order's signature tactic was the pig's head, a tight armored wedge built to punch straight through enemy lines. Meeting that wedge in open ground was suicide. Nevsky's militia would be trampled before the fighting even properly started. He needed ground that worked against heavy cavalry instead of for it. He found it on Lake Peipus. A frozen lake in early April was a gamble in itself. Solid enough to march on, but thinning fast under the spring sun. Nevsky likely understood this lake better than his enemy ever could. Through local knowledge or hard experience, he knew this was ground the knights had never fought on before. Heavy armor, warhorse, rider, weapons. A fully loaded knight carried weight no militia soldier ever had to think about. Nevsky didn't need the ice to fail. He just needed his enemy to fight somewhere their power turned into a liability. He picked ground near a rocky outcrop that narrowed the open space, forcing the knights into one predictable line of attack. On the morning of April 5th, fog lifted off the lake, and the two armies finally saw each other clearly. The Livonian knights looked across at a thin militia line and felt nothing close to concern. To men who had never lost, this looked like an easy morning's work, over before the sun reached its peak. That contempt was exactly what Nevsky was counting on. The trap was set. Now everything depended on whether they'd take the bait. Nevsky's center was deliberately weak. Raw militia placed there on purpose, meant to look like an easy target. His real strength, the Druzhina cavalry, waited out of sight on both flanks, hidden by the terrain he'd chosen. If the knights stopped to scout the flanks, the plan would fail before it began. If they charged straight ahead, certain of an easy break, they would walk exactly where Nevsky wanted them. The order to advance was given. Hundreds of armored riders began moving forward across the open ice. There was no hesitation in that charge. Why would there be? This formation had never failed them before. The pace built from a trot to a full gallop, hundreds of armored riders closing the distance fast. Nevsky held his line and let his archers loose first, not to kill, but to provoke the charge forward. Most arrows glanced uselessly off heavy armor. The knights barely slowed. They had no reason to. The wedge slammed into the Novgorod center with brutal force, exactly where Nevsky had planned for it to land. The militia held just long enough, then began falling back, not breaking, but retreating with deliberate control. To the knights, this looked like collapse. They pushed harder, certain the battle was already won. This was the moment Nevsky had been waiting for. The deeper the wedge pushed, the tighter the trap closed. Without realizing it, the Order's formation was sliding into a pocket shaped like a closing crescent. Then the signal came. Hidden cavalry struck from both flanks at once, slamming into the wedge's exposed sides. Heavy cavalry needs room to build speed and turn. Surrounded on three sides, the knights suddenly had neither. Riders collided with riders. A charge that meant unstoppable momentum seconds earlier became a crushed, tangled mess. Knights still pushing from the rear had no idea the front of the wedge had already slammed to a halt. Officers shouted new orders into the noise, but the formation was now jammed against itself, with nowhere left to move. Novgorod's foot soldiers closed in with spears, axes, and hooks, pulling knights from their horses wherever they found an opening. Trapped inside their own formation, knights couldn't swing a blade or turn a horse without striking one of their own. Once a fully armored knight hit the ground, getting back up alone was nearly impossible. Some tried to reform the wedge's point and push through again. There was no open ground left to push into. The fighting stretched on through confusion, exhaustion, and desperate struggle. The open ice churned by hooves and panic. The confidence that had carried them all morning was starting to curdle into something closer to confusion. Thousands of men and horses were now packed into one narrow, chaotic stretch of the lake's surface. Some accounts describe cracks spreading underfoot from that pressure, though historians still disagree on how much the ice actually mattered. A few knights still shouted for the line to hold. Most of their own men could no longer hear them. What's certain is this: trapped, crowded, and losing ground, the Order's discipline, their greatest strength, was starting to break. The first calls for retreat went out. Quiet at first, then urgent, then openly desperate. Orders to regroup were shouted, but lost in the noise of clashing steel and panicking horses. Nevsky had saved one final card for this exact moment. His reserve cavalry was about to decide the battle. Nevsky struck at exactly this moment, sending fresh reserves crashing into the Order's exposed rear. What had been a contained collapse turned, in the space of seconds, into open, uncontrolled panic. A desperate stand collapsed into a full, disorganized retreat across the weakest stretches of the open lake. The battle was over. The disaster was just beginning. Knights fled in every direction, discarding shields and weapons, desperate to move faster across the open ice. Novgorod's riders pressed the chase hard, giving the fleeing knights no room or time to regroup. Some chronicles describe sections of the lake giving way during this chaotic retreat, though the details vary between sources. Whether from the freezing water, heavy equipment, or the chaos of retreat, many who fell through the ice never returned. The terrain that had carried the Order to victory after victory now refused to carry them off the battlefield. Novgorod's forces pursued the scattered survivors for miles, refusing to let the retreat regroup into anything organized. The battle had ended almost exactly as Nevsky had hoped, though even he likely understood how much had depended on chance. The Order had suffered one of its most damaging defeats in the region, a defeat that would echo for years afterward. Surviving prisoners were marched into the very city they had come to conquer, now arriving as captives instead. Had the militia broken instead of holding, the wedge would have shattered straight through to Novgorod's gates. Had Nevsky charged head-on instead of luring them in, his army would likely have been destroyed within the hour. A Livonian victory would have dramatically strengthened the Order's position across the region. It could have placed enormous pressure on Novgorod and its allies for years to come. It became one of the clearest signals that further expansion into the region would not come easily. Novgorod celebrated its young prince as the man who had saved them when everyone expected total defeat. Nevsky didn't chase further conquest after his victory. He secured peace terms instead, protecting his borders for years. For the Livonian Order, the lesson was blunt. Novgorod was no longer an easy target on any map. Their momentum in the region, built through years of expansion, came to a sharp and lasting halt at that lake. The battle proved something brutal and simple. Superior equipment means nothing if you're fighting on ground your enemy chose. Contemporary chronicles recorded the outcome clearly, even as specific details, especially around the ice, remain debated today. What saved Novgorod wasn't luck, and it likely wasn't a broken lake either. It was terrain, timing, and an enemy too confident to notice either one. The Livonian knights lost because they trusted the weapon that had always saved them, without ever questioning the ground beneath it. Nevsky won because he understood the battlefield better than the men who had spent their whole lives fighting on one. History remembers the battle. Strategy remembers the trap. Subscribe to Epic Sagas for more true stories where brilliant minds changed history.